who is assistant professor of Hebrew in our Department of Germanic Languages, but who also has
Germanic, Slavic, Asian, and African languages, please.
Okay,
Don't. And linguistics. And linguistics. It's basically the department of everything, of all the languages and linguistics that are not Romance languages.
Ah, excellent.
Because MSU has two different departments. It's complicated.
Much like we have 5 biology departments. Yore has a long-term interest in experiential education and in introducing people to the passion of education and love of sciences. Yore also is, in Hebrew, means the first rain of the year. And since this is the first Create Science Seminar series of the year, we're delighted to have him to sprinkle rain on all of us and inspire us.
Snow and ice on all of you. Yeah.
This is also, we hope, the last seminar series that will be in this room. In the future, we hope to have them down in the new space down in Create. So if the next one you show up for, you find this room full of people doing yoga or something, then you know that you can either stay or you can come down to the Science Center downstairs. But without further ado, Dr. Kedem.
Thank you so much. So since there's not a lot of people here, what I would like to start actually with introduction so that I know who I'm talking to. That would be useful, and we can have a little bit more of a conversation today than just me talking at you the whole time. So since you introduced me.
Yeah. Deputy Director at Create, and my native background was physics.
My name is Michael Lockett, and I study curriculum theory.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. My name is Krista Damry. I'm a 4th year teacher ed. Was biology for quite a while.
Mm-hmm.
Now looking at social-emotional aspects of learning.
Mm-hmm.
Julie Wool. I'm a postdoc studying student thinking in biology.
Okay.
I'm Vicki, first year student of education psychology and educational technology, and then my interest lies in understanding student engagement in STEM context.
Very good.
I'm John Paul. I teach at East Lansing High School.
Okay.
Izzy, postdoc Create, physics, don't say?
I'm Dan Smith. I'm here from the theater department.
I'm Emil. I'm a postdoc doing part of the project of the MCM multi-computational modeling.
Okay.
I'm David.
Yeah, you're the last one.
David
But not least.
David visiting from Israel. I actually co-taught a class with Rezdat.
Yeah,
way back.
many years ago. So my name is Yore Kedem, and if you read the flyer, I'll tell you a little bit more about what I do or what I did as a researcher. So I did my PhD at the University of Illinois in education, and what I studied was aesthetics education. So I looked at the education of what it means to become a musician. And I'll talk a little bit about a small snippet out of my research today to talk about some of the aspects that I'm discussing in this presentation. But generally, I have absolutely no training as a science educator, except for being the son of a science educator. And my dad has been active in Israel as a science educator for many years. The way that I got to do this presentation is kind of funny. I won a fellowship this year from MSU, and the fellowship pays for travel expenses. So I needed to do something to use these travel expenses, because since I'm not a researcher anymore, I don't go to conferences, I don't do these kinds of things that this is supposed to pay for. So I talked to my dad, and he said, he can help me put together, a presentation in the Weizmann Institute where he works, so that I can present it over there. So I put together a presentation for them on this topic. And then I had to translate it into English so that I can get the funding from MSU. So then I said, I hear that there's Great for STEM here because I have friends and colleagues that have been working here for a while, practically ever since I got here. And I said, okay, I'll send it to them and see if maybe they're interested. And they said yes. So this is how this came through. But please don't ask me to explain to you anything in physics, in biology, in chemistry, or computer science, or any of this stuff that you intelligent people deal with, because I really have no idea. But when I talked to my dad over the years, my dad is very much an experiential learning person. He works a lot with science demonstrations. He designs them, or he finds them, he designs them, he puts them in contexts and uses them to train teachers and help teachers. And over the years in our conversations, he would tell me about, on the one hand, the great enjoyment that he's had doing this when, my dad has a very good sense of humor, and teachers would sit in his talk and write his jokes, in their notebooks. But he would also give a science demonstration, a scientific demonstration doing, my dad does crazy things like making people listen to music through their teeth. And science teachers would come to him afterwards and say, that was amazing. Could you come to my classroom and do the same thing with my students? And what my dad was saying, no, I want you to take these demonstrations and do them with those students. I don't want to be the person traveling around and doing the shows for your students. And my dad claims that there are two things that show you that the scientific demonstration was a good scientific demonstration. One is if kids say, oh, how beautiful, or how great, or how nice, or how cool, whatever it is that you want to say, that kids feel that it was fun and interesting and engaging for them. And the other thing is when a kid says, can I take it home? And do this with other people. With the family and the friends, and show kind of a show and tell and take it home to their own life. And so this kind of brings me to the topic of today's talk, is to ask how can we better integrate these things into the curriculum and what teachers can do to be more creative in this sense. So the first question that I would like to pose to the room is, what the heck for? So what is science education for? All you science educators, and maybe non-science educators. Why do we do science education? Open question. Anybody has any ideas? Yes?
To get kids to pass standardized tests.
That's one. That's one. Okay, that's a good one. Okay.
We'll go the other end of the spectrum.
What?
I said I'll take care of the other end of the spectrum, Bob. So to help humans understand their relationship with the natural world better.
Okay. Other points?
It's an important part of human culture.
It's an important part of human culture. Okay.
Makes them more productive citizens.
Thank you. This is very important. Thank you, Chris.
I think it increases their aesthetic appreciation of nature.
I would hope so. So the question is, one of the questions is, what are the goals of science education? And when people talk about, when you go to the government and say, we need funding for a research project, there's a goal for that research project, or there's a goal for developing a certain curriculum, and there's a goal to doing what we do because we think it's important. So the idea is to ask what are the goals, and some, the things that you mentioned here should be goals of science education, or can be goals of science education. But also we have to ask how students grow. So does a student that now knows how to formulate Newton's second law, did that student grow as a person or not? That's a good question that I think needs to be asked. And then, of course, we need to ask what is experiential learning and what is its role in science education. And again, that's something that I'll try to discuss in this presentation. And then, of course, the final question that I will ask is, what can we learn from aesthetics to bring into science education and learning design in science education? Now, before we go to this, a lot of these ideas we discussed. Actually, David was over for dinner one time, and we kind of chatted through these things. And you were there for dinner the other day, and we chatted about these things. I have Tom Bialik worked here as a postdoc for 3 years, for the last almost 4 years, I think. And he's a really good friend, and we've been talking with him a lot about these things, and of course with my dad. So a lot of these ideas kind of developed in conversation. I'm not presenting this as anything that I have written extensively on, or that I have a paper that's going to be published in the leading journal. This is intended to help all of us think a little bit more in depth about these issues. I would want to claim that most science education is organized based on a list of things that certain people think that all students should know. The way it usually works is that you have a committee of scientists and sometimes science educators that are saying this is, usually it would be the physicist, for example, for physics. And I actually heard I can't remember his name right now, but a guy who's a Nobel Prize winner in physics that complained that the people that were coming from undergraduate to the graduate degree in his lab didn't know physics. So he needed to make sure that they know physics. So he went and studied education after winning the Nobel Prize in physics, studied education and designed a way of teaching Physics 101 in a better way so that students are more prepared to study physics at university. And when they come to his lab to do undergraduate, that they're more prepared to do the graduate work, that they're more prepared to do the graduate work. And then I asked him afterwards, did he find any, because he showed that his method worked very well. Then I asked him, do you now have more students who come better prepared? He said, no, we can't really measure that. And that was kind of interesting. But anyway, that guy says, OK, people that come to my lab, they have to know A, B, C, D, E, and F, and G. Let's dumb it down a little bit and teach it to undergraduates. Let's dumb it down a little bit more and teach it to high school students. Let's dumb it down a little bit more and teach it to middle school students, and so on and so forth. But there's a list of things that every student should know. That's why we have standards, because standards is what the expectation is that the student should know at a certain point. There are certain skills that they should have. They take certain math. They cannot do high school physics without knowing how to do some math. They have to have these math skills. They have to know how to plug and chug for a way of looking at this. And then we need to be able to measure and evaluate. Do they know this? Do they know this? Can they do this? Can they not do this? And these are the things that we can measure, we can report, we can test, and we can quantify. And that leads to an approach to teaching that for here I would call conservative teaching. That doesn't mean that all teachers are teaching it in the same way. That doesn't mean that the teachers are not doing interesting things in the classroom. That doesn't mean that, that every teacher teaches exactly the same stuff or the same things. But conservative teaching assumes that knowledge exists. The knowledge is already there. You open the textbook, the knowledge is in the textbook, and it is the teacher's job to know this and to give this to the students. It's possessed by the teacher. Hopefully they went to MSU, did a degree in science teaching, and now they know how to teach the science that they learned, and transfers it to the student. By the way, anybody here read Paulo Freire? Paulo Freire calls it the banking system of education. I possess it, I deposit it in your mind. This is my job as a teacher. And then this is something that we can measure, we can assess. I know the 100% of the material as a teacher. What percentage of the material that I know does the student know? Okay? It's the basis of our standardized test method. Thank you, Bob. But, and there's this quote from Dewey. This is from 1901, so this is 116 years ago. And I think there's an important point here, because students know how to plug and chug, or because students know how to solve a question that a question in science that somebody else already knows the answer, that doesn't necessarily lead to them growing as human beings. So then there's a question, okay, there's conservative teaching. Now let's look at what creative teaching means. And then we have to ask, what do teachers create? And can we teach teachers to be creative? And that's another really big question. You know, is creativity an innate quality in a person? Or is creativity something that can be taught? Are people just born creative, and some of us are creative and some of us are not? Or is creativity something that can be taught? So to talk about this, I'm going to talk about aesthetic experience, and since I am talking about something that's aesthetic, I will play a short bit out of this second movement of Beethoven's Seventh Symphony, conducted by Leonard Bernstein. This is a recording with Vienna Philharmonic from 1978. And I won't play the whole clip, just part of it. Oh, but you're not getting this. Wait. So I have a video. Okay, now. So the question is, let's see. Okay. So the question is, what happened here? And I apologize for the quality of the sound. So,
Dynamics in the music, what happened?
yeah, what happened?
It built.
It built up,
Yeah, it built
and
up
then
it started way back.
started way back, right? And it repeats, there's a theme that repeats there, and it builds up, and it builds up, and it builds up, and it culminates, and then it comes down. And of course, I just played 3 minutes out of an amazing 9-minute movement. But what we have here kind of crystallizes the concept of aesthetic experience, the way that Dewey talks about it, the way that Hans-Georg Gadamer talks about it, and I will give you some quotes from both. But an aesthetic experience is temporal, meaning that it starts at a certain point and it ends at a certain point. If you think about anything that we experience aesthetically, our experience of it is temporal, right? We have, if we go to see a play, we have 2 people from the theater department here. Go see a play, the play has a beginning, the play has an end. Usually in a play, and it is complete, and it goes over time. So it's not one thing that happens at one moment and that's when it's over.
So life isn't an aesthetic experience?
What?
So life isn't an aesthetic until you die, right?
Life, I would say that life is composed of aesthetic experiences.
Yeah,
But-
life as a whole.
Well, life as a whole, once you die, you cannot reflect upon it, so therefore it is not an aesthetic
You don't know
experience.
that.
If it's my life, I hope that I don't have to reflect upon it for eternity afterwards. It is unified by emotion. There's an emotion there that ties the whole thing together. And it does reach a culmination, right? So with this theme, and with this kind of a feeling of impending culmination that Beethoven does, that Beethoven creates, and it culminates, and then it ends. It's immersive. When it's a really great experience, when it is a great aesthetic experience, we're in it. We're not thinking about it, we're not analyzing it, we're not trying to understand it, we are in it. And that's a very, very important aspect of it, because we can understand it only upon reflection. So only when the experience is over and we stop to think about it and to reflect upon it can we understand what happened there. And so we have to have a reflection, and the question is questions that we can ask ourselves when we have a meaningful experience, and this can be an aesthetic experience. What's the difference between an aesthetic experience and just a meaningful experience? If somebody goes to a really beautiful place. You go to, I don't know, I remember going to France and seeing the Mont Blanc in front of me one day in the morning. It's a really amazing experience. But as a non-religious person, I don't believe that God created that mountain so that I have an experience with it. On the other hand, an aesthetic experience is when you experience something that was intended for your experience. So when Beethoven wrote his 7th Symphony and composed the movement the way that he composed it, when Bernstein is studying this piece and builds the tension in the piece the way that he did, choosing the right tempo and choosing the right, and working with the orchestra the way that he did, he intends that for people's experience. And so that makes a difference between an aesthetic experience, when you're having an experience with something that was intended for you to experience, and a meaningful experience that you can have just by going somewhere and experiencing something that wasn't necessarily intended to create that kind of experience, but it might give you a meaningful experience. So the question is, how did I feel when I heard this? Anybody is willing to share their emotions with us? With Beethoven's symphony? Yes.
Well, I was very interested in the conductor actually watching that film, and so I had some kinesthetic empathy, I think, with the experience of his movements of kind of...
Now, what's really interesting is when you see this video, you don't see him as he's intended to be seen, because he's intended to be seen from his back. That's how the audience sees him. But in this video, you get to see him from the front.
Also create a video
Yeah.
as an intent, right?
Exactly.
To shape
And
that.
so there's another aspect of that there. By the way, if you ever want to see, if you ever go on YouTube and try and look this up, this is one of the most amazing things you can ever see, is Danny Kaye with the New York Philharmonic at Lincoln Center. And he conducts the orchestra with his face to the audience and making all the faces that the orchestra conductor makes, and all the gestures that the orchestra conductor makes to the people that are playing in the orchestra, but he's doing it to the audience. It's fabulous. It's amazing to see. So that creates also this feeling of experience, right? There's something in that video that's not like just hearing it live. So there's another layer of the idea of there's an experience to be created. Other people? I'm sorry, again, the sound wasn't really, really great. The dynamics in these systems are not great. David?
I think one of the things that happen there is that you stop to think.
Mm-hmm.
Cognition disrupts aesthetic
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah.
So if you're thinking about what's happening, you're not being
Experiencing it.
experiencing it.
Yeah, exactly.
So if a good aesthetic experience, as you defined it, leads you to stop thinking.
Yeah, immerses you. Immerses you. It says to you, just be in the moment, just be there. You know, some people talk about this as the flow. You know, Csikszentmihalyi refers to this as flow. But and then to ask ourselves, why does this feel important? Because just having that kind of an experience, you can be really involved with a football game, or with a soccer game, or with a basketball game. But nobody is playing that game intending for you to, to change necessarily. And then, of course, there's the aspect of perspective. An experience is changing the understanding of prior experiences. So when you have a meaningful experience, the only way that you can understand that new experience is by reflecting on prior experiences that you had. Okay? And Gadamer talks about this in the sense of a hermeneutic circle. A hermeneutic circle is a circle of understanding when things change continuously. So if you think about your new experience and you understand it in the view of old experiences, it sheds perspectives on these old experiences, which means that those old experiences are now have changed for you. And then, of course, now that they've changed, again, your understanding of the new experiences changes, and you create a hermeneutic circle, not one that reaches it doesn't reach a conclusion necessarily at the end, but it's a continuous process of change. And then, of course, if it does become a significant experience for you, you use it to understand future experiences, because now it is the baseline from which you now understand new things. Okay? Again, in the same sense. It can bring deep conceptual change. Dewey says that at a certain point that people justly call it a religious experience sometimes, because the idea that you had an experience with something that now changes the way that you understand something so profoundly that it is almost as a religious experience. But it can also bring a nuanced conceptual change. It's not necessarily that every experience you should go and expect your world to fall apart and be built together again. Okay? So it could be nuanced, could be deep, but the idea is that an experience is meaningful because it creates change in your understanding of whatever it is that you experience, of the world, or whatever it is that you're trying to understand. So, since I'm a classically trained musician, I was really interested in these questions in music. I remember actually in 1996, I was traveling I was young, back in the day, and was traveling with some friends in Venice, and we went to Murano, and we saw this guy who built a horse out of glass. And my friends were like, this is amazing, he's an amazing artist. And I said, he's an amazing craftsman. I don't know about his artistry, but he probably makes 100 of these a day in front of tourists. I don't know if this is an art or a craft. And we had a really long conversation about it. So this is kind of part of the title of my dissertation. And then I looked at what it means to interpret music, and I came with this kind of a continuum or kind of a definition. What is a conservative interpretation of music? It believes that the truth originated by the composer of the piece. This actually, the earliest evidence of hermeneutics in that sense, in the conservative hermeneutics, the conservative interpretation that we have, is in the Talmud, which is an old Jewish text that's commentary on the Torah. The Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, has laws that tells the Jew what God wants for them. And the Talmud is commentary on that, which means that rabbis sat and said, we believe that God wrote the Torah. And when we are interpreting this text, we are trying to aim at the meaning that God had in him when he wrote that text. So a conservative interpretation believes that the truth originates with the person or the thing, in the case of God, that created the text. And most of the time, people that go to schools of music or the academies of music, or another word that we use for places where people study music? Conservatory. Why? Because that's where you learn to conserve. They learn the traditions. So I know people who can trace their roots through their, trace their mentors. It's called, they can trace their mentors all the way back to Beethoven. So they say, my teacher studied with the teacher who 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 studied with Czerny who studied with Beethoven. And therefore, if I'm studying with that teacher, I have a direct connection through the traditions to those original true ideas that Beethoven had in his brain. Never heard some of them. But you understand why I said that Beethoven never heard them? Okay. But he heard them in his mind. Okay? But that you have a connection to that through those traditions, through your mentors. And then you learn the knowledge that you need to learn, which means that you need to know how to analyze harmony and counterpoint and melody, and study and develop your skills. You have to practice your instrument, you have to do ear training, you have to do all this stuff that I didn't really enjoy for 5 years at the Academy of Music. And then there's creative interpretation. What is a creative interpretation? Creative interpretation says, I have a text in front of me, and I need to understand this text. I cannot assume or presume to aim at what Bach meant or what Beethoven meant or what Schubert meant when he wrote this, because I can't give him a call and ask him. And even if I did, maybe it's not that important. But I have to understand this text. And because it is my understanding of this text, I'm creating a new understanding here that wasn't here before me. The other part of it is understanding the text through performance. So it's not that you're reading, and again, we have friends here from the theater department. It's not as if you're reading a text and you're saying, okay, I'm just going to sit here and read it in my mind and imagine the scenes in my mind. You actually go out and perform it. And the performance changes the text. The text is not the same after you have performed it, not in its meaning to you. The words might be the same, but the meaning of the text to you is not. And that's something that, that changes and grows. And then the idea is that if you are a creative interpreter, what you create is you create experience for your audience, which is something that Gadamer called Lebenskunst, which is the art of experience. And again, I'll let you read this because all of you read English better than I do. So an art of experience is something that comes from experience and goes to experience. And that's, I think, really significant and important, especially when we go back to educational ideas. Because when we understand our own experiences, then we can create experiences for other people. And that's something that I looked at in my research. I studied the Pacifica Quartet, which was quartet in residence at the University of Illinois back in the day. They're now quartet in residence at Indiana University, and actually half of their staff changed last year. So 2 of the people that I'm mentioning here are not members of the quartet anymore. So CB's violin studio, he was the second violinist of the Pacifica Quartet, an amazing violinist, a very amazing teacher, and very, very, very conservative. I asked him actually why there were no discussions in so much discussion. I saw more discussion in the other studios that I investigated. They said we don't have time. They have to learn so much stuff. They have to be able to do all this stuff. And if we stop there and have a discussion about music in the studio, then they won't know everything that they need to know by the end of their degree. And the other indication that I found how his approach was conservative, and again, not in conservative in the sense that he was a boring run-of-the-mill performer or boring run-of-the-mill teacher, but conservative in the sense that he believed that there was a truth to that piece, that the student can learn and that that truth is originating from the composer. He would ask students questions that he knew the answers to. And that actually happens a lot in the classes that I teach in Hebrew too. I ask a student, what's the answer to this? And if they give the right answer, it's the right answer. If they give the wrong answer, it's the wrong answer. It's a kind of an either or, okay? And that's a way for me to test whether they know, but it's not a way for me to teach them something that they didn't know before. And then there was a more creative studio, was the studio de violist, where he basically said to a student in one of the lessons that I've said, you can vibrate from your arm. Vibrato is something that we use to warm up the tone on a string instrument. He said you can vibrate from your arm, you can vibrate from your wrist, you can vibrate from your finger, and you can combine all of them in all kinds of ways. Experiment, and then you can decide how you want to do this. By the way, with him it was interesting because with CB, with the violinist, when it was very, very concrete and very, very conservative until maybe a lesson or 2 before the performance, where a student would come in with an interpretation that's maybe different from CB's interpretation, and he would let it be. It would be like, okay, I did everything to prepare you, but now it's your choice, your chance to be more creative. And in Masumi's studio, I saw something opposite, where he was like, oh, experiment like this and experiment like that, and then a student comes to the last lesson before a concert, and he says to her, oh, by now you have to decide. So something has to be there, something concrete has to be there, So at a certain point, it can be creative interpretation, but you have to make sure that you can actually deliver that interpretation. And then there was also collaborative experience in the cello studio, where I would see chamber music classes, and the students would be playing, and the teacher would be standing up and singing with them. And he's not singing with them to tell them how to play. He's singing with them because they are making music together at that point. And then, based on these ideas, I also designed a study abroad program in Israel. No undergrads here, so I can't plug it, but I'm going to another class to plug it right now after we're done here. I do a study abroad class in Israel that's based a lot in these ideas. It's an inquiry-based class. Students, my job in this class is to create connections between the readings and the experiences that students actually have in Israel. Inquiry-based learning in this context is that students basically spend about the first 10 days of class reading through things, having some experiences, but after 10 days into the class, they have to come up with a research proposal. They write a short research proposal, and then they have to use their experiences in Israel to do this research. So it's not that a lot of study abroads, there's a separation between the meaningful experiences that students have and the academic stuff. And in my class, it's all about their experiences. Actually, the readings are there to facilitate their understanding of their experiences and not the other way around. There are structured written and in-class reflections. So students, every 2 or 3 days in class, we sit in a semicircle and ask students to tell me what was the most meaningful experience that they had in the last 2 days and what they've learned from it. And then, of course, I also ask them, how did that promote your project, whatever it is that you're interested in? And then they also send in written reflections to me. And then my thinking about this is that students have an experience in a day. For example, on the first day of class, even before I introduce myself and the syllabus to them and everything else, take them to Central Jerusalem, orientate them a little bit so that they know where they are. Most important, that they know where to meet me 2 hours later. And I tell them, okay, find a place to sit down, observe for 2 hours, write down what you see, and talk to at least 3 people in the street. And so we have these experiences 2 more times during the class, and other experiences and places that we go to. And my job is to build this in a way that there's an arc there that connects these experiences, to ask myself where this is going to culminate, how this is going to culminate. So I look at the whole class as an experience, but I also look at the specific experiences within it and how they're built. And then it is, of course, my job to have an understanding of that structure so that these experiences hopefully are meaningful to me and therefore meaningful for the students. What change in growth do I see? So for the students, there's, of course, significant understanding of the course topics. There are certain things that until you go there, you don't really understand. And I have students who studied Israel in all kinds of contexts. And then they go to Israel, and their understanding of it is completely, I make a mess of it, which gives me ample pleasure. Students also have to deal with emotion and conflict. And that's one thing that people don't so much talk about in the learning experience part. But sometimes you have an experience that really causes you emotional stress, not only pleasure. So I want to say 3 years ago, I had an MSU class. We went to a town in northern Israel, to a research and development center in an Arab town. And the guy that hosted us, I asked him to talk about the things that he really feels about what it means to be. He's a PhD in physics. He works there, develops really interesting projects with solar energy, and there are other people around him that work on such projects. But I asked him, how it feels to live in Israel, and he said some really, really harsh things. One of my students left crying, and then I had to speak with her for an hour and a half afterwards in a coffee shop to help her unpack this. So a meaningful experience, an experience that shakes you, is not necessarily a comfortable, easy, fun, loving, beautiful experience. Sometimes it can be a really shaking experience, but that doesn't make it less strong or less important or less meaningful. And of course, it brings them deeper understanding of the course topics, which are cultural diversity and immigration in Israel in a personal way, in a local way in Israel, but also in a global way, because the idea, and again, that's a quote from Gadamer. Gadamer talks about the idea that what we understand, the way that we understand things locally and personally changes our understanding of the world, and our understanding of the world changes our understanding of ourselves. So it's not this kind of, again, I understand the world, now I understand something about myself, and that doesn't change the way that I understand the world. This is a continuous hermeneutic circle. And for me, as a teacher, I keep on understanding more and more about this stuff. Not that I know everything about it, but my understanding of it changes because my students talk to people that I didn't talk to. My students bring perspective that I don't have, because I don't have the perspective of a 19-year-old that grew up in Michigan. I have the perspective of a much older person that grew up in Israel and then spent a lot of time here. Okay? But so my perspective changed, and my experience, the way that I experience and understand Israel, changes because these students have meaningful experiences. And then, not the least important, is it really strengthens my educational identity, because it makes me feel that I do something significant for my students when I see how their understanding and the changes and how they grow as people, even within a very short period of time in Israel. And knowing that I was somewhat conducive to that growth, and that who I am and what I am has an impact on them, it's a very significant thing for me personally as an educator. So another small aesthetic experience. I'll give you 30 seconds of a minute to look at this. Here's the psychologist question. How does that make you feel? Anybody? By the way, this is one of my pictures. So I took this one.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I was wondering how it can be classified as aesthetic experience since there's no culmination.
Well, but I did give you time to look at it. So it is temporal.
I would have also asked whether you looked at the whole thing or whether you started by looking at the foreground and then looking at different parts of it and then coming back.
Is a way to understand this differently. If I remove this whole part here, is it a different picture? So if you look just at the clouds and the forest in the background, by the way, this is from the UP here in Michigan. And those of you who want to know how you do something like this, I have a filter that's a 10-stop filter, so it makes my camera think that it's really, really dark out there. So it leads to a really long exposure, and you get the lake without any of the motion. All the waves that were there basically become one thing, and the clouds you have this kind of a flow in the cloud that comes from the wind, because this is, I think, a 1-minute exposure or so.
Is it not ice?
No, it's water.
So I interpret it as ice.
Yeah. So did it make you feel cold because you interpreted it as ice? Yeah, yeah. It was really interesting. I posted this online, sent this to my family, and my aunt from Germany said that it made her feel really calm. And my sister said that it was stressing her out.
So I had a whole journey with it, right? So I felt isolation initially, and then kind of solitude and comfort with the solitude. And then I started thinking about the seventh seal, and so I was like, oh, Death is going to walk in up to the death with me. And then I thought, oh no, I'm Death, and I'm waiting for the guy.
To each their cultural references or their previous experiences, right? But again, the idea is that, when I put this picture on, I don't know what you guys are going to feel. It doesn't even matter what I felt when I made this picture, or what the weather was like, or, who was in the car with me or not with me when I was driving through there. But something from my experience being there and my experience working with this picture, because believe it or not, it wasn't in black and white originally. Making all these aesthetics decisions with this picture has led to me to create something that you can experience. Okay, so this is, in a way, Erlebniskunst. It's an art that comes from experience and goes to experience. So to go back to teaching and teachers, if we look, and I want to thank one of my office colleagues, because we talk about craftsmanship, but most of our teachers are not men, and so we can talk about craftsmanship. So we need to talk about teachers as craftspeople. And that's actually, I would claim that most teacher education deals with these aspects, with the craft of teaching, which is that teachers know and understand the material that they are going to teach. They know how to structure it for the students. So they don't put the cart before the horses. They don't expect students to know things that they don't have enough of a basis in understanding to know these things, that they can't expect students to do certain manipulations. They don't know how to do don't have the skill to do these. Teachers should be able to demonstrate scientific notions, right? So here's this idea. Now let me give you a demonstration on how to do that. And they should develop scientific skill in the students, and not less important, they can assess what the students know and what the students can do at the end. I would want to argue that that's about 99% of teachers' education. But then if teaching is to be an art, then we can look at teachers as creators of experiences. Not all the time, not in everything that they do, because they still have to do all the other stuff. But if they spend 95% of their time in the classroom doing the other stuff and 5% of their time in the classroom actually creating meaningful experiences for the students, then we've done something good. Because now we're not only tending to what students know, what students can do, but to steal from Dewey to students' spirits, who they are going to be as people, and how they're going to grow as people. And in order to do this, we have to ask teachers what experiences were meaningful for them. Because I would want to claim that nobody in this room is doing what they do without having had an meaningful experience with something that led them to where they are. There's nobody here that one day said, oh, now I can solve this equation that I couldn't solve yesterday in 8th grade, and now I want to be a mathematician. Okay? There's an experience with something that made us feel meaningful, that gave us a meaningful feeling about what we do, that led us to where we are. And we need to talk with teachers about these things in order to get at what their experiences were. We need to ask them, has your understanding of whatever it is that you were looking at or experiencing changed through these experiences? How has your understanding of X, Y, or Z changed through having one experience with it, and then another experience with it, and then another experience with it? Now the question is, okay, my dad comes and does a science demonstration. How can a teacher take this science demonstration and use them to create a meaningful experience for her students? It's another important question. How are these activities connected to the materials? Because let's say that students are now studying, I don't know, energy in 8th grade, and I come and demonstrate to them, I don't know.
Energy is connected to everything.
Yeah, of course. But I don't know. I come and demonstrate to them how an elephant breathes. Okay? Now, could be a really nice scientific demonstration, but if I don't know how to connect that to energy, then it's just a fun activity that they do. They say, oh, that's really pretty, maybe I can take this home, but that's where it's over. And it is the role of the teacher to know how to connect those activities to what happened before in class and what will happen in the future. We need to ask teachers to create reflective activities, meaning that it is not just that they do the activity, but they also have given opportunity to students to stop and reflect. This can be immediately after the activity, this can be 2 days after the activity, this could be a week after the activity. But if we don't let students reflect, then they think that, my reflection is just for me. And it's not really meaningful because it's just, I changed a little bit, but maybe other people have a different way of understanding things, and this is important to be shared. And then we need to ask, how can this kind of teaching or learning be evaluated? Because when we evaluate according to standards, that means that the people who write the standard know what students need to know. But when we evaluate this kind of learning, which is the growth of the student, the only way we can do this is to evaluate from within, is to understand what that student or those students knew at the beginning, and how they went through a process of their understanding changing to where they are. And that's a very different kind of evaluation. Portfolios, things of that sort, sometimes could serve for that, not always. But the idea is to have an evaluation of the process, not only of the product of learning. And I think that in the end, a teacher that feels that through the process of learning to become a teacher and through the process of teaching over sometimes many, many, many years, when she grows, she's empowered. And when she is empowered and grows, she is more and more educated. So it's a never-ending process for her. And I think that places like this university and other teacher training institutions should strive to give teachers an opportunity to do this and to understand how much it empowers teachers to feel that what they do belongs to them and is meaningful to other people. So if teachers are trained to feel and to understand that they are creators of meaningful experiences for their students, it gives a lot of meaning to their activities in the classroom. Thank you. And now, please, questions, comments, things that, if you think that I don't know what I'm talking about.
I just have another question about the defining something as aesthetic versus just meaningful. You said that in order to be aesthetic, it has to be something that was intended for you.
Intended for somebody to experience.
Intended for someone to experience. Though, without some religious intervening, I wonder then how anything in nature could be an aesthetic experience.
I don't think that when you have an experience with something in nature, just something in nature, it necessarily can be defined as aesthetic. Now, when a science educator, a science teacher, designs an activity and makes that activity, performs that activity for the students or has her students perform that activity, she is designing the activity, and so she is creating an experience for her students. The thing that they're experiencing has that aspect of nature, right? You said you're in biology, right? So they see, I don't know, we have these beautiful flowers here. So let's say they take a camera and they document how a flower opens, right? With the old Disney films from a long time ago that used to do this, like it's called stop motion, right? What? Time lapse. Time lapses of how a flower opens, and they describe it, right? The flower itself is a beautiful thing, but designing the activity where the students observe this and understand this, and when it starts and when it's over, all that is incumbent on the teacher. And that creates an aesthetic experience for the students. It's not the flower itself necessarily, unless somebody believes that God opens the flower like this so that we think it's beautiful. And that's up to the person's personal choice.
So does this mean that people can't have that aesthetic experience without someone guiding them?
I would, without somebody, if somebody did not create that experience for them, I wouldn't want to call it aesthetic experience. I would call it an experience. What Dewey does, when Dewey wrote Art as Experience, he starts with the live creature. So he says, this is how live creatures understand and learn about the world. I have a dog. My dog doesn't read books. He doesn't watch TV. He doesn't watch YouTube videos.
I know he's not watching TV right now.
No, maybe right now. But all he learns from experience. Living things learn from experience. Okay? We experience the world all the time, and we can have a really significant experience with something in the world. But I would hesitate to call it aesthetic when it wasn't created for us to have that experience. Because if that is not, then everything is aesthetic.
Except you can create that for yourself. You are the own designer of your own.
I would say that one of the things that I've learned over the years, ever since studying these things, the way that I have changed, is that I have learned how to open myself to experience. somewhat. Meaning that, I would go somewhere and for a concert, and I would learn the violin, I played the violin, I did all these kind of things. I would show up to a concert, and I would sit in that concert, and I would count the mistakes. That was wrong. The oboes came in the wrong place, whatever. Okay? I went to conservatory. What do you want? For a long time. I was not only conservative, but I was also coming from a point where I knew what was right. And having read a lot of this kind of stuff taught me to, pull back a little bit and how to both physically and mentally prepare myself to have a meaningful experience with something. Photography is another really good example. Taking a picture like I showed you, that's not something that I took the first 2 days after I started taking photography seriously. It takes a while to learn. It takes a while to see. It takes a while to, you have to accumulate certain experiences until you're there. And when I take photographs, some of you know Tom very well. So we would go with Tom, and he would just take, snap pictures. And when I go take pictures, I go take pictures. It's not me being somewhere and just happen to take a nice picture somewhere. I go there with the intentionality, and that's the other part of it. I don't have an intention of certain specific meaning to convey, but I have an intentionality to experience and to create an experience.
So I think one of the things that you're feeling here, right, because I have the same reaction that my colleagues do, right, is that those of us who are science educators, right, who are deeply engaged with nature, right, we're not coming from the artistic community where our purpose is to design an artistic experience that is crafted in quite that way.
But your designing activities.
No, because all of us at some point have had what we would consider aesthetic experiences with nature, right? So it's the delight of a young child spraying water out of a hose for the first time and seeing the refraction of the rainbow and being delighted with wonder at that experience, right? And those kinds of, right, that whether it's, the first time that you're interacting with the complex physics of general relativity or whatever, form the motivation in many cases for us to pursue the
That's why I would say that is an experience, that it is a meaningful experience. I would just hesitate to call it an aesthetic experience. That's the only hesitation that I have philosophically with this. Okay? Now, I'm not saying that you don't experience beauty. You do experience beauty. But
I don't think it's important that we call the experiences that we try to design for children as aesthetic or as meaningful, as long as they are, emotional, and they arouse some appreciation, something beautiful. So exactly whether it's aesthetic or beautiful is not important. But, I think one of the problems with the way you've laid out what a teacher does is that you begin from the designing of the experience, and then that leads to learning, so we start taking apart the experience, and the process of taking apart the experience typically destroys the experience, it no longer, it no longer retains the same sense of awe for people. Getting down to details analytically thinking about it destroys the holistic sense of something. So for instance, the photograph, you start figuring out exactly why this roost of that,
it's not the photograph anymore.
It's not the photograph anymore. One of the problems, I think it's very important to design emotional experiences. But one of the problems is that while we are the creators of the experiences, the teachers, and then we take them apart with the kids, we don't allow the kids to return, to create, to express themselves in a way, that is not just measuring how much they know standards and so on, but to express themselves in a way, which allows them to try and create an experience for the person who is looking at what they're done. And I have some background in Waldorf education, and one of the key parts of Waldorf education is that the kids create, their own. They don't have books. They create their books, and these books have to be very aesthetically pleasing. try in writing or whatever, drawing and whatever,
Yeah.
to recreate an experience which simulates what they had in class. I think that's something that's very much missing.
Yeah, well, it's coming from experience, going to experience. And that's the idea of Erlebniskunst. I'm definitely not saying that what the teacher should do. If this is what's understood from my talk, then I want to make sure that I explain very clearly. I hope that the teachers do not take an experience apart for the students. I hope that the teacher asks the students to explain what the experience meant for them.
Will that
Because
lead to the learning that we hope kids to construct?
I would say that what this would help to do is for students to understand that their reflections are meaningful, that what they understood from their experience is important for the teacher and for other students in the classroom, and that they will understand that sometimes something has multiple perspectives, so not everybody had the same experience with the same thing. To say that I will design an activity that will demonstrate Newton's second law to the students, and afterwards I will take it apart and show them how exactly this worked, and then the students will memorize it and spew it back at me in the test at the end of the 8th grade, that's not what I'm talking about. Okay? What I'm talking about is the idea that, and I think in the sense what you're saying, you're taking Erlebniskunst another step. So now that the teacher created an experience for the students can take these experiences and create experiences for others. There's nothing wrong with that. Of course, you can't, it doesn't matter how many apples you'll drop on a person's head. It takes to be somebody, need to be Newton to understand, how this actually works, right? So just learning by experience doesn't replace all the rest of the stuff. The rest of the stuff is really, really important. But I think we should care and pay attention and put resources and effort into helping our students grow as people. And this, to me, this is the way to go about it. Because having more standards and more stuff that they need to know, or stuff that they measure, stuff that I can measure that they can do, does not necessarily help them grow as a person. Now, I had a long conversation about this with Tom when I finished my presentation in Israel. We sat for a beer, which is the best way to discuss these kinds of things. And he said, but all the government says, oh, here are the standards, here are the textbooks, now, just teach this. The government doesn't care about values. And I said, no, the government cares very much about values, but it teaches values everywhere else. But science is full of values and full of meaning, and is part of human culture. So to say, okay, we'll leave this to the literature professors and to the civics professors and to the English professors to deal with values, and we'll leave science out of it. We'll leave culture to all the other people that deal with, things that have flowers and rainbows in them, and we'll leave serious science stays out of it. I think that that's wrong. I think that there has to be an understanding that when you say that the child is playing outside and she understands something, I don't think she understands something about relativity, but she can appreciate the beauty of what she's seeing, and that might change her, and then she can maybe decide to go deeper into it. I think that those kinds of feelings should not only happen outside the classroom, they should happen inside the classroom. And they should be part of the academic stuff that we do with the students, because this is education, to me. This is education in the sense of helping students grow. It's not less important. Maybe it is even more important.
So help me find the edges here, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you go back a slide or two,
Yeah.
You're presenting this notion of
Teaching as art.
Teacher as conductor or creator of the aesthetic experience, right?
I would say that, no. I would say that the artistic aspect of what the teacher does can be the creative experiences that he creates for his students, or she creates for her students. That's what would be my claim. That there's no art without craft. There can be craft without art, but there's no art without craft. So the craftsmanship of teaching is significant. It's important. Nobody says, okay, close College of Ed, and start over. That would be silly and stupid and not conducive to anything.
Okay.
But I'm saying that also there's an artistic part of teaching, and that part is not less important, not less significant, and not less of an important opportunity for a teacher to feel that she's doing something meaningful for her students.
But several of those things there, right? So particularly on the evaluation component, right, are not something that we typically associate with art. But reviewers aside,
We said that at the beginning. He has a quotation that measurement doesn't work as well with things that are experiential.
right?
Yeah.
But I can assess, and I do this with my student in my study abroad class all the time. I can assess, I know what they wrote about in the beginning. And I can assess if their understanding of X, Y, or Z changed through this class.
The question, I think, here is whether the experiential part contributes to the kids' learning of the things on which they and the teacher and the school is going to be assessed. Okay, that's the question. If it doesn't contribute to that, people will argue that it's time not well spent, and they have a point. If what counts is what you're being measured on.
Yeah, but on the other
If
hand,
we figure out a way, okay, to measure, if what counts is what you're measured, as long as we don't know how to measure these things, okay, that's the only reason to do it.
Or we can say we can,
measurement doesn't count.
or we can say we can assess and not necessarily measure. We can assess and not necessarily measure. Measure has a scale. There's a scale 0 to 100. The student knows 0 of the material, knows 100% of the material, and I will measure. But I can assess to say, okay, students thought about this in X way in the beginning, and through the experiences that she had in my classroom, now she understands things differently in the end. Her understanding of this changed because she was open to these experiences, because she can describe what she learned from these experiences, and that's why her understanding changed. I don't know where she will go with her understanding, but I want and hope for her understanding to change. And that way, this is an evaluation or an assessment of growth in that student. This is what's called evaluation from within, not evaluation from outside. And again, I'm not saying one should replace the other. I'm just saying we should be able to give students an opportunity and teachers an opportunity to do these kinds of things, because it should make everything a little bit more meaningful for everybody. That's the argument that I'm arguing. I'm not saying one instead of the other. I think that would be silly and incorrect of me.
Well, I think that I agree with you. I think that the teacher should be very creative.
Mm-hmm.
No? But I was thinking, for example, in a class when 80 students, not to say 250 that they have here, for example, in the chemistry department, how I as a teacher can prepare some activities when I have that amount of students. It's almost impossible.
I'll tell you. Why do they put 250 students? Why do they? What's the educational argument to putting 250 students in a classroom?
I don't know.
There isn't one.
Like
There's only a business argument for putting 250 students in a classroom.
yeah, to me it's like nonsense.
I
You can pay attention to all of them. You don't know all of them. You can know how they are developing their.
I agree with you completely,
and
but
it's
that's.
like
But that's because this university is a business and it has to educate a lot of students so that they pay tuition, you know.
But even when I said what I as a teacher, as elementary teacher, high school teacher, the groups are smaller. My argument is, well, I have the standard and the government give me the textbook.
Mm-hmm.
Even in those cases, I think that I as a teacher can reinterpret the textbook and can do some things. The point
If the
is
textbook
that
talks about something,
science-
yeah.
that science is not, well, to me, I like that many students think, but I have to put some limits, because if I don't put some limits, they could understand the one thing that I don't want to
It's not a
understand.
free for all. You do an experiment. You can create an experience in class
Yeah.
that demonstrates or shows a certain principle that you want to give. Now, you can ask students how they understood the experience and then explain the science behind it. One thing does not negate the other. One thing does not negate the other, and it's okay. So in social sciences, we deal with misconceptions all the time. So I take students to study abroad in Israel, and they expect Jews to be one thing, Arabs to be another thing, Orthodox Jews to be another thing, because they read about it in a book or they met two people in their lives that trained their brain to think about people in a certain way. It's my job to hear these things, to send them on an observation, to have them learn something that might be completely opposite to how it is, and to locate it in a larger context to complicate their understanding of this. To do all these things, nobody says that this is a free-for-all. And somebody can think that I don't know, apples fall from the tree because we are jumping towards the apple instead of the apple falling towards the ground. But actually, both things attract each other, I'm told. But it's not. I'm not saying this is a free-for-all, and it's not a simple thing. The whole idea of this presentation is to say that if we are to care for our students' spirits, our students' person as a person, one of the things that we have to take care of is the kind of experiences that they have, and to create these experiences in a classroom where we can have either some semblance of control over these experiences, and second, to use these experiences for them to grow in their general understanding, but also in their specific understanding of science. And that these experiences need to be contextualized, need to be within a classroom, and not just say, okay, students will go and when they will learn really how to be good geologists is when they go for a dig somewhere, in the Rockies during the summer, and they will dig some stuff with rocks, and they will pull them apart and find something really, really interesting to them, and we'll leave it to the informal education stuff. Because what happens is that we leave experiential learning to informal education. And with informal education, we're dealing only with the formal stuff that's defined in the standards, and that's defined everywhere else. And that's a real shame. That's not education to me. That's teaching. Sometimes it is learning. But education in the sense of people becoming who they are, who they're going to be, very little of it. Yes?
I wanted to ask, I was a chemistry teacher for almost 8 years, and you talked about the audience, like you perform for the audience, and sometimes the audience, meaning the students in chemistry, they wish you to perform hazardous experiments.
Yeah.
They like to watch gases
explode. Of course.
Go out and rapidly. That's what
highly exothermic.
Highly exothermic. That's their thing, and I would like to. And when you perform it, so few, as for the Apple, but few students go on and ask why and how. And I wanted to ask you, do you find this like experiences as beautiful, or why they are beautiful? Because they are actually, some of them are dangerous.
Again, I wouldn't say beautiful or not beautiful. That's not for me to judge.
Okay.
When Marcel Duchamp put a urinal in the museum, it wasn't because it was beautiful.
Okay.
So art is not only about what's beautiful, and aesthetics is not only about what's beautiful. To me, the idea of art in this context, and there's many definitions of art, and we won't go into this conversation, like there are many definitions of science, by the way. To me, the idea is that creating a meaningful experience, if you do it intentionally, then it is an artistic endeavor. And then, of course, some students will go and do something with it afterwards, and some students won't. But at least you'll give them an opportunity to do that. And one of the things that we are lacking is the opportunity for students to have those meaningful experiences in the classroom many times. Most of us are not where we are because we had a meaningful experience in the classroom. We had a meaningful experience somewhere else. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Next week, Great Seminar Series continues with David Portis. Hopefully we'll have it downstairs in the great room. Yore, we want to give you
thank you.
a gift and thanks. We appreciate you coming over and sharing with
Really
us.
appreciate it.
Thanks, folks.